Hello. So, we're going to do register. Alright? It's one of them areas of linguistics dealing with language and how language changes depending on who you're talking to. Your missus, say, or your boss. Get the idea? I'm not going to talk to my missus the way I talk to my boss. That's right. I'm more likely to utilise a more socially appropriate register. Welcome to the study of register. To describe register is to describe aspects of the situational context that makes a difference to how we use language. So studying register is in part studying the linguistic features that characterised what Halliday called the interpersonal function of language, and how this interacts with the ideational or conceptual function of language. Alright, remember these guys. Adorable, right? Well, maybe not 100% of the time. Okay, so listen to this. A baby who won't stop crying can drive anyone to despair. You feed him, you change him, you nurse him, you try to settle him, but the minute you put him down, he starts to howl. Why? The most common reason baby cries is hunger. Even if he was just recently fed, he might still be adapting to the pattern of sucking until his tummy is full and feeling satisfied until it empties again. When he was in the womb, nourishment came automatically and constantly. Alright, I'll stop there. Did you find that reassuring? Read this. Okay, let's compare these two texts. In terms of their content, they say very similar things. Sentence by sentence, there is great similarity in terms of the information, right? The content of what is being said. So how exactly are they different? Well, let's compare them more closely. First, their openings. With the first text, it's as though the problem that the text is addressing, babies who won't stop crying, is being referenced in terms of the action of a particular case. A baby. It could be my baby. But in the second text, it's as though the problem that the text is addressing, babies who won't stop crying, is being referenced in terms of the behaviour of a class of things. Infants, it's a class, who are characterisable by certain features or conditions. Their incessant cryingness. They are things that cry. Well, the text goes on. This crying behaviour can drive anyone to despair, or can lead anyone to despair on the part of the caregivers. In the first text, it's as though the anyone could include me. But in the second, we hear only of the class or category, which we might belong to, the caregivers. Not only this, but the first text seems to be more direct about the reaction to crying babies. It can drive us to despair. I can relate to this. Maybe it's driving me to despair. But in the second text, we're spared the directness with a more detached stance. It can lead to despair. And the text continues in a similar vein with the next sentence. Text 1 seems still to be speaking to us. You feed him, you change him, you nurse him, you try to settle him, but the minute you put him down, he starts to howl. Why? It's as though it was saying that you and I try different things to no avail. Whereas the other text talks about an intervention. When intervention X is ineffective, and what are the interventions? They are listed as a series of abstract nouns, notice, changing, nursing, soothing, rather than the actions that you might usually do and expressed with verbs like you nurse him, you try to settle him down. But text 2 tends to treat babies instrumentally. Actions and personal agency, then, is a big feature of text 1, while classes and objective categorization is a big feature of text 2. Even action is objectified as an intervention. And what's the reason for all this crying? Well, the insight provided by text 1 and text 2 seem almost identical. Text 1, the most common reason baby cries is hunger. Text 2, the most common reason for crying is hunger. Yet, in text 1, you may recall, this statement was preceded by a question. Why? It's as though the speaker of text 1 understands that this indeed is a question for the reader, that there is even a reader present. This is a question for you. In the second text, the expertise is offered in a vacuum, so to speak. So text 1 recognizes that there is a concerned reader who is being spoken with, while the second text focuses on objective analysis. We could say that the stance of text 1 is best characterized as from the perspective of a friendly fellow sufferer, while the stance of text 2 is that of a distant objective specialist, right? Alright, let's stop the analysis here. I mean, feel free to go on with it yourselves, because I'll make sure that this text is in the materials that go with this presentation. I hope you can see, though, that both texts are ideological. I mean, really, all texts are ideological. There's not more information or more insightful information being shared in text 2 compared to text 1. Yet text 2 seems more authoritative. It seems that, doesn't it, when you hear it? And text 1 seems, well, more friendly and personal. But to repeat, they both contain largely the same information. Well, earlier, when I read out text 1, when you were looking at the pictures of babies, I asked if you found it reassuring. I can now ask the question in a slightly different way. Are you more reassured by a text which acknowledges you and your agency as something that is shared by the author? Or are you more reassured by a text which provides an objective and expert-like analysis of the phenomenon? And there's no right or wrong in this, but it would be an interesting thing to think about. What I'm really interested in here is not evaluating these texts, but to show you how they are different and how they carry ideological implications. Text 1 would, with its emphasis on action, reinforce the idea that babies are motivated human actors. Parents, me and you exist, are empowered to take responsibility for them, and we're all in this together. While text 2 would reinforce the idea that babies cry because, well, that is what babies do. The phenomena of babies cry. The problem is with the phenomena, according to text 2. The problem is with the baby. Okay, so register matters. What exactly is this business register? To describe the register is to describe aspects of the situational context that makes a difference to how we use language. The situational context. This is very important. It's easy to forget that whenever language is being produced or reproduced, it always occurs through a social situational context, and this impacts the linguistic resources that are used. So, if the context involves two people who share similar experiences of life, we might expect texts to be formed like the first baby text, a text written in a relatively informal register. If the context involves the institutional practices of science, where a body of valid objective knowledge is being represented, perhaps to an audience who may not be equally informed or expert, well, we can expect texts like the second sort, written in a relatively formal register. So I'm sure you can see then how this business of register and the linguistic implications that it has is of enormous importance to teachers and learners. Because, well, certain registers enjoy a privileged status in the academy, in schools. The so-called academic language is the kind of language that is close to the second text in our sample, so we need to kind of understand what's going on with it. So how does linguistics, or perhaps more accurately, sociolinguistics, study all this? Well, as a result of the work of the linguist Halliday, there's his picture, M.A.K. Halliday, and being scientific about it, there are some aspects of register that can be usefully distinguished, and Halliday and linguists who follow him want to say that there are three aspects, basically, in any situation that have linguistic consequences. And these are tenor, the role relationships between text users and producers; field, what the language is being used to talk about; mode, the role of language. Well, that's it, those three. So let's take each one in turn. Tenor refers to the social role relationships played by interactants. For example, student to lecturer, customer to salesperson, friend to friend, specialist to specialist, specialist to non-specialist. So compare these two. Imagine someone is trying to get some help with moving some heavy furniture. Hey, Nick, get off your butt and give me a hand over here. Shove that chair closer to the desk, will you? All right. Not the most politely worded request, but you don't know my brother. Anyway, compare this with this one. Oh, Dr. Smith, I'm just trying to tidy my office up a bit, and I wondered if you'd mind maybe giving me a quick hand with moving some furniture. If you've got time, I mean. It won't take a moment. Now, if you could just move this chair over a bit nearer to the desk there. Thanks very much. So how do these differ in terms of their linguistic features? Well, here are a few things to consider. The choices of vocatives. This just means terms of address, what people call each other, like Dr. So-and-so, for example. The use or the avoidance of slang. Mind your P's and Q's, my grandmother used to say to me when I was a boy, meaning mind your pleases and thank yous. The use of imperative clause to get something done congruent with purpose in the informal text, but the use of the interrogative clause to get something done incongruent with purpose in the formal text. Okay, you're going to have to read that several times probably. So let me unpack it a little bit. What on earth is this saying? What linguists call imperative and interrogative refer respectively to grammatical form signalling a command, do this, or a question, how, why, where, what, who, when. Informal registers, this is interesting, I think, and maybe not too obvious, but informal registers often involve a congruence, an agreement between the grammatical mood and what is being asked, right? Congruence between the grammatical mood and what is being asked. So, for example, move that chair. Whereas formal registers tend to use incongruent clause structures, as in would you like to move that chair? So, in that example, you aren't really asking a question, interrogative. You're making a request, imperative. Are you really asking a question when you say to your class, would you like to sit down, class? This request can be, confusing if you don't understand the register, because you're not really asking them a question, you're telling them to sit down. Alright, let's keep going. Interrogatives also involve the use of words like would, could, mind, and these words modulate or attenuate the request. Could that heavy chair be moved, I wonder? Really means, help me move that chair. So here's a summary of some linguistic consequences of a text when the tenor aspect of the register is informal. And here are characteristics of formal register texts. What determines the tenor of a text really comes down to three variables. The extent to which we have frequent contact with someone usually makes an impact on the register. The more frequent, the less formal, and vice versa. The extent to which our roles are equal or not equal. In the second baby text, the author gave the impression that he or she was addressing a relatively non-specialist audience, I felt. I would say the tenor was specialist to non-specialist audience. Because in the first baby text we got the feeling that the author was sort of one of us, really. Thirdly, the extent to which interactants are emotionally involved, that's also going to impact the tenor of the register. The white-coated scientist, academic, physician belongs to an institutionalized practice that values objectivity and detachment. So there is an involved versus a detached continuum here. Alright then, well, so much for tenor. There were three dimensions to the register of any text recall. Tenor was just one of them. The other two are field and mode. So I want to close now with a quick look at field and save mode for the presentation on writing and speaking. So here we go with field. Quite simply, field is the situational variable that has to do with the focus or content of the activity in which we are engaged. It's the topic of the situation, if you like. And this definition is easy to remember if we think of the field of science or the field of history, although that can be a little bit misleading because really every practice has content. A field is not just an academic discipline. Well, one of the obvious ways in which the content of a field becomes apparent is in the choice of lexemes. Lexemes? Come again? Sorry. The choice of vocabulary or content words. Lexemes simply means vocabulary or content words. Okay, but my choice of word there, lexeme, just signaled that I'm in the field of linguistics. So I'm trying to illustrate, this notion of how we signal fields. Okay, let's consider these two texts. What's the difference here? The tenor is the same, and so is the mode, specialist to non-specialist. But what distinguishes these texts is their different fields. PCs versus babies. Now, I certainly don't want to suggest that babies are just the same as computers. They're far more complicated than computers. But I do want to illustrate this notion of field. It's involving the choice of words, the lexemes. Is this all there is to it then? Just vocabulary, choice of lexemes when we're talking about the field? Not quite. There's also what linguists call lexical density. What's that exactly? Well, this is going to take a little bit of explaining. We all know what a taxonomy is, right? Linguistics is full of taxonomies. It's a useful way of expressing the ways things are related to each other. And, often we find ourselves drawing a semantic map or a graphic organizer, like the one you're looking at, which comes from biology. Because doing something like this gets us thinking. It's a heuristic. It's a good thing. But even if we don't go in for this sort of thing, our knowledge of a field can be said to involve knowing how concepts are related to each other, whether or not we take the trouble to make a map. So the more expert we are in a field, the more intricate would be the web that represents our knowledge, the more branches it would have, for example, and most importantly, the more sub-branches and sub-sub-branches and sub-sub-sub-branches and so on, the deeper we are in the field. Okay, so imagine a text which was written by a field expert who was so deep in the field that he or she only bothered to mention the sub-sub-branches and the sub-sub-sub-branches of their knowledge. If you didn't know that autotrophic organisms were a subset of eukaryotic organisms, but only the multicellular variety, mind, you might be way lost. Alright, I just made that up looking at this graphic organizer. I've no idea what I just said. But you see that folks who are really into this stuff might not bother to tell you how things are related, because they may be assuming that they're dealing with specialists who are equally comfortable with a deeper taxonomy of their field. Or it's simply just too difficult for them to spell it all out to a non-specialist. It would be very time consuming to do that. So you see the problem here, the issue. It's not just a vocabulary issue, it's a taxonomic issue. When I went to my first basketball game ever, on soon arriving in the US, I asked my US friend, steeped in the practice of basketball, what had just happened in the game. He was sitting next to me, and he said something like, the guard dribbled down the court, held up 2 fingers and passed to the open man. Oh, thanks. What on earth is he talking about? So, when linguists talk about a text's lexical density, they're referring to the selection of vocabulary based on deep taxonomies. It's not enough just to have a large vocabulary. You have to know how certain words relate to other words in the field. So you can see how important it is to get kids to make semantic maps. All right, well let's summarize all this by comparing everyday language and specialist language. Finally, let's summarize the field aspect of situation like we did with the tenor aspect of situation. Field, content, what the language is being used to talk about, basketball tactics, autotrophic organisms, crying babies, whatever. There's really one continuum here. Knowledge, the extent to which it is represented technically, drawing from deep taxonomies, or non-technically, drawing from shallow taxonomies, and hence the continuum here is shallow to deep. Okay, as the moon rises and the sun sets once again, we've come to the end of another presentation. This one covered an introduction to the concept of register. We saw that register is to do with the way a context of social situation has linguistic impact. Social linguists like Halliday have divided register into three aspects: tenor, the role and relationship part of a situation; field, the knowledge or type of practice; and mode, the role language is playing in the social situation. Well, we didn't get to this last one, and that's going to be the topic of the next presentation. Though incomplete though, I hope you can see how important this way of looking at language is for teaching. I mean, many students, me included, have often felt intimidated by the way language is used in a field or academic practice. Academic language is typically in a formal register, and yet we live out our lives mostly in everyday registers. So getting comfortable with these formal registers is an important part of becoming successful in the academy. And we know that owing to our social situation, not everybody is linguistically equally poised to be able to do this. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on all of that. But here's something else to consider too. Why is academic language the way it is? Is it really just an exercise in exclusion? I think we're really doomed if it is. What are the linguistic aspects we can usefully get some insight about to help us expand students' register repertoires? How can we help them see the ideological implications of these different forms? Formal registers have some advantages as well as some social disadvantages, but what are they? If language can be used in a way that shuts people out and alienates, well, then there's a moral imperative for us to understand better what might be going on. So, more on this in the next presentation. But as always, I hope you've enjoyed this one. Take care.